So, from a very kind of broad perspective, can you tell us a little bit about the difference between income and wealth?
Well, income is generally what you earn at a job, and it's the money you bring in for that labor. But wealth is about the total assets that you own, including things like your home, your car, stocks, bonds, 401k, all of those, what we call assets, minus the debts you have. So minus the student loans, the hospital bills, credit card bills, and all the things you owe other people. And so there are lots of people with high incomes, but they have low wealth. And it's an important distinction because when we're talking about things like student debt cancellation, there's this belief that people with similar incomes have the same ability to pay. But we know that wealth makes it enables a person and their family to pay off those debts quicker because they can lean on a 401k, home equity, and other sources of wealth. And so it's a big distinction that we really do need to make, because when you only talk about income and not wealth, you essentially are burying your head in the sand to the racial inequalities that prohibited Black people in particular from not being able to garner wealth.
Okay, so dig down into that a little bit. And can you tell us about some of the gaps in income to start, some of the gaps in income between white population and those who are not white?
Yeah, there's significant gaps in income, largely because there's drags of racism in the labor market. We know that there are differences between the pay of Black women, Black men, white women, Hispanic men and women, given same educational experience, educational levels, similar experiences. Black women, Latina, generally get paid less for equal work. And so we know that employment discrimination exists, and we have lots of studies to back that up. We even have a lot of studies that show that many people don't get hired simply because their names project that they are a member of a Black or a brown community. And so income certainly matters, but it really shows up or presents itself in the way that discrimination is embedded in our markets.
Okay. And so moving from there, from that discrimination that's embedded in our markets to this kind of bigger question about assets and what you need to actually get through kind of a rough period in your life, what about gaps in wealth between white populations and populations who are not white? How do we explain those? Where did those come from?
Well, I know you should not explain wealth differences by saying that one group doesn't have financial literacy and another group does, which is often the case. People will say, well, why didn't you save? And why didn't you do X, Y, Z individual behaviors in order to get more wealth? But the reality is that there's been a number of federal policy, federal, state, and local policies that prevented Black people from gaining wealth. And there's generally three big areas where that occurred. Obviously, slavery essentially extracted wealth by denying people income for their labor. I mean, if you want to call it that, it was slavery. In addition, you have Jim Crow racism or segregation, which said, hey, separate but equal policies that prohibited Black people from going into more resource white institutions. And then finally, a major bucket that wealth was essentially extracted or denied for Black people was the New Deal, including redlining after the Homeowners Loan Corporation deemed predominantly Black neighborhoods too hazardous to receive various housing subsidies, either refinancing opportunities or down payment assistance. And so because Black people were not able to get those things during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, it prohibited those families to pass on a home and that equity to their children and their children to their children. So these are federal policies that denied Black people the opportunities to accrue wealth, not notions of individual decision making and all these other things. Federal policy has been the major blocker, if you will, to Black people getting wealth.
And just to be clear, the New Deal and other federal policies like that, I mean, they were designed for families to be able to buy houses and accrue wealth and things like that. But they specifically blocked Black families and non-white families from being able to do that.
Yeah, and it wasn't by accident. In some cases, some parts of the New Deal, there were deals made between the president and members of the Southern legislature to deny groups or sectors in which Black people predominated from getting certain benefits. So if you worked in agriculture or housework, you were denied specific benefits. And then the redlining practices obviously just said if you live in these neighborhoods, you can't get refinancing. And so it was purposeful to deny Black people, and that's why we often say anti-Black legislation, where on the surface they're colorblind, but it doesn't take long to read between the lines to see that they were anti-Black in nature.
Since the New Deal, are there any kind of more contemporary policies or institutional racism that continues to extend these gaps? So we see the gaps starting, we see them exacerbated with the New Deal. And then is there anything even more recent that continues to extend the gap in wealth?
You know, my research revolves around home values. And I did a study along with my colleagues, Jonathan Rothwell of Gallup and David Harshbarger of the Brookings Institution, where we measured home prices in Black majority neighborhoods and compared them to home prices in white neighborhoods. And a lot of people will know intuitively that homes in Black neighborhoods are priced lower than their white counterparts. But a lot of people, again, will say that's because of education, crime. But those are things you can control for in a study. And that's what we did. And we controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found is that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about 48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's about 156 billion in lost equity. 156 billion is a big number. It would have financed more than 4 million businesses based upon the average amount Black people use to start up firms. It would have financed more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over, covered almost all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. And so it's a big number, but remember, I say all that to say that we had the Fair Housing Act. We've had a number of policies since it was legal to discriminate against Black people. But many of the practices that were born of those segregated times or during that times where it's legal to discriminate, many of those practices are still in existence. And I'll just say one in particular. We talked about home values. One of the most explicit agencies or a group of people to explore home prices are appraisers. And they use a process which a lot of processes that do what we call price comparison models, where they compare homes within neighborhoods to get a sense of value in that neighborhood. But when you compare homes in neighborhoods that have been discriminated against, you can recycle the discrimination over and over and over again. And so that's a relic, a holdover from segregated times when appraisals were used as a tool, as a weapon to keep Black people out of communities. And those things still exist. And so that value difference that we have identified really speaks to there are drags in the market, racist drags in the market that we've essentially maladapted to, that we have gotten used to. Just as we knew about value difference in the past, and we could point to policies, but there was a time people said there's nothing wrong with those policies. And likewise today, when we see these value differences, we should assume that there are drags in the market that's prohibiting Black people from accruing wealth. And so we know that they're there. It's our job to not just look at appraisal systems. We have to look at the job market as the job market, and we have to look at real estate agent behavior. We have to look at lending practices. There are still holdovers from a period of segregation or a period of when it was this legal to discriminate they're still with us.
You mentioned job market again, and that we need to make sure that we're kind of looking at entire systems and recognizing when there might be holdovers. So in terms of racial discrimination in the job market specifically, can you tell us a little bit about how and why that racial discrimination persists?
Well, I mean, I'll put it very plainly. There are still significant employers who do not trust Black people. And regardless of your experience, your educational levels, we still see wage differences. We still see hiring differences. You know, I once had a employer tell me that in Alabama, tell me they can't find Black workers in STEM. And I said, hold up. And I literally counted up all the STEM graduates from HBCUs in Alabama institutions, which has the largest amount of HBCUs in the nation by state, and added them up just from the graduates in that 1 year. And you know, it was laughable, this idea that you cannot find Black STEM talent. It's just laughable. But what that was really saying, that you're not willing to look, because this is not a supply issue. This is just an unwillingness to work along racial lines. And then we also just see, again, evidence of discrimination in pay. You know, it goes without saying, like that Black people who have with the same degree, with the same experience, get paid less on average. And so for me, it is very simple. There's employment discrimination because employers still operate under these social norms that facilitated discrimination. And until you see employers really making an effort to, one, diversify the managers, the management, the people who hire, to sort of hedge your bet, so to speak, so that people can at least have another advocate in their business. So one is about diversifying the workforce, but a lot of it is just trying to unlearn the racial stereotypes that prevent people from getting hired in the first place. So it's changing too slow for anyone's good, but we are seeing changes in the job market, a recognition that Black Lives Matter, but it's still just woefully inadequate in terms of pay, in terms of hiring, in terms of all the numbers. I mean, clearly, whenever a jobs report come out, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, or as we're easing out of the pandemic, you still see very different unemployment numbers between Black and white communities. And so there's this discrimination at every turn between in education and hiring, and so forth. So we see it in the job market in the form of who's hired, who's not, and pay levels.
I've also read that it can be related to the fact that even if Black employees are hired, there's almost a maximum level of management that a lot of Black employees get to. And so if they're only at middle management, they're not in the hiring position. And so companies sometimes think they're doing what they need to do, but they're not actually putting people in positions where they can hire more diverse employees.
In higher education, I know the good folks at VCU don't do this, but when you look at higher education, there's a big difference between who gets hired, who gets tenured, who serves on the board, and who becomes president. I mean, a lot of the conversation on diversity revolve around students, not on the workforce. And when you see where Black people often are concentrated, it's not in the faculty ranks, certainly not in the senior faculty ranks. It's more in things like HR, food services, and all those things. And, it goes without saying, we should see diversity from top to bottom. And that means we should see a good share of white people in food services. We should see a good share of white people in lower management type of areas. That I mean, and if we had a system that was free of racism, we would see this diversity. And so, from higher ed to corporate America, this is what plays out. And folks will, skirt the issue by saying, and like I mentioned in higher ed, they'll talk about student diversity. But in corporate America, folks will talk about the money they've given towards racial justice and not do anything about their hiring practices, not do anything about the benefits packages that they're giving out, the pay disparities. And so a lot of people just skirt this diversity issue. But again, that for me, that's purposeful. It's because people don't want to see a change in power that goes along with equity.
I would argue that's not just for you. I think that's fairly
Yeah, that's right.
widespread, that people don't want to lose their power, and so they continue to recycle the same kind of systems and arguments over and over again. So we don't see any changes in diversity in higher ed or in corporate America, et cetera.